Certified Penetration Testing Professional, Module 2, Penetration Testing Scoping and Engagement. As we've said all along, the scope is critical. So we're going to look at how do you initiate, engage, and proceed with a penetration testing assignment. Well, as you can imagine, pre-engagement activities is the foundation. So we're going to use this to manage and execute the penetration testing environment. It's extremely important that we do this and plan for the environment. So you never want to skip this. The better you plan, the better your test will actually be. And it's extremely important to avoid things such as scope creep, unsatisfied customers, and even legal issues from the penetration testing engagement. So we start determining the goals of the test during this actual pre-engagement activity. So the first component we have to be aware of is a request for proposal, or otherwise known as RFP. So they distribute the RFP when they want to do what? They want to get some people to quote on the test, right? So if they want to evaluate security of the organization, they want to identify insecurity issues, they want the findings and recommendations. That's what the RFP is. Then the technical information is a statement of work that tells you what they're going to do as part of that RFP. And then they have the schedule of events, and that's the timetable for the events for the engagement. All of these are part of that RFP, or request for proposal. And the submission. So what happens is the proposal response to an RFP, or an actual information gathering, depending on what it is, RFI, request for information, you're going to have a structure. So we have an example structure for you here. Now remember, we're just showing you different examples. So in some of these sections, we got examples for you. They're in your references, those types of things. They're just giving you an example to use. So when you look at the components, of course, we have the executive summary. That's your synopsis. That's your high-level overview of what's going on with the engagement. Your deliverables. What are you going to provide the client when you get done? And then the pricing. Details on how your charges are calculated. And then any relevant experience or things you want to call out about your team. And then your approach and methodology. You got to tell them if you're following a systematic approach. If you're not, they might think you're an ad hoc tester. Then project management, who's going to actually manage the project. And then references. Any references you can use and show of your past work. And then finally, a briefing about your company. Information on the company, the address, and any types of information you can share about it. Keep the common evaluation criteria in mind before submitting your proposal. Always read the RFP and see what the submissions are going to be evaluated on. They usually have a point system, so they give you points for different types of components of the actual requirements that they're looking for. Pay attention to that. So common evaluation, your decision is based on what? What are you going to do for them, right? Did you respond in responsiveness to the RFP within the time? And then, of course, the price. Price is going to come into this. It always does. And did your price match what your information that you're going to provide is going to give them? And you have to look at the completion of the response, make sure you complete it, make sure it's done, it's thorough, right? Those types of things. Propose an effective solution based on the requirements. Make sure you understand it. They almost always have the capability where you can ask questions about anything you don't understand in the RFP. And then can you deliver the service against the specifications? Your experience, stability, past record could be looked at. And then the team. Who's on your team, and are they skilled enough to meet the needs of the requirements? So we prepare a response requirement for the proposal submission. Number one is the scope, the approach, and the methodology. Number two is determining the project deliverables. Number three is the schedule. Number four is how do we staff it, staffing requirements. Number five is proposing detailed and itemized pricing. And number six is submitting the proposal. These are our steps for preparing to submit to a proposal submission. Here's an example. One of the things we need to do is get preliminary information from the client. So we send a document to the client. We have to know the scope. So we got to have the networks, the devices, all the other types of information, what kind of testing they expect, all those types of things. The more information we can get from the client, the better we can tailor our cost based on the requirements and the work effort. The goals of the penetration testing, the organization's goal for the purpose section of the RFP, what are they looking for? What they want tested, and then the primary and secondary goals of what's going to take place when it's tested. And then if it's driven by business risk or driven by compliance. And when you look here, you see the different goals and whether it's a primary or secondary goal listing. So we get this to the client as well. Clarity of scope is key to getting value from the pen testing. Scope is the critical thing. You want to make sure that you have the clarity of scope so you understand what you each want. So how do you scope it? Well, we got to determine what they want, what will be tested, how it's tested, what resources are allocated to testing, what the limitations that are going to be applied, and what business objectives are going to be achieved, and how the project will be planned and scheduled. That's all part of scoping the penetration test. And it ensures what? Consistency and high success rate of the test. A carefully defined scope, preventing collateral damage. You want to make sure you don't damage something inadvertently. If you don't have a scope clearly defined, that can cause problems from the beginning. That's why you want to make sure that you have solid factual data when you prepare your scope for the penetration test. You have a meeting with the client. Once the goal is identified, you figure a scope and you proposed in the meeting. Make sure everybody understands, number one, what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, right? The rules of engagement and cost, right, are not discussed in this meeting. Right now, we're just trying to find out, review the RFP, request for proposal, make sure you understand the components the way they intended it, and then the questionnaires. Look at your questionnaires and ask any additional questions about the scope so we can properly estimate the scope requirements. Here's an example of a sample questionnaire for you. We won't go through everything here, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Network penetration test. Why are they having it? Is it required to meet a specific compliance requirement? Are we pen testing 24/7, or do we have specific hours we have to follow? How many IP addresses are we going to be testing? Are there devices in place that's going to make it difficult, like IDS, IPS, stuff like that? In the case of systems of compromise, how should we proceed? This is just a sample questionnaire from you from the pen test standard, which is the URL there on the slide. More information, are we doing web application testing? Are we doing social engineering testing? Are we doing wireless network testing? Each of those have questions and components that's contained within that, which will help you get a better idea of how to do a cost assessment on the engagement. The business unit managers and the questions for the systems administrators. So you have actual sample questionnaires that will go in and give you the information for these different entities, right, and those types of things. Types of testing, penetration testing measurement, right, which is kind of like a metric. So the way we explain it, we have a smarter approach. And each one of those characters means something. S is for specific, measurable, so we said we need metrics. A is for attainable, R is for relevant, T is time-bound because nothing's unlimited with time, E is for evaluate, and R is for reevaluate. These are all our different types of things that we want for an objective-based test. Points of the compliance test, understand the requirements of standards, frameworks, and laws, different types of things. PCI DSS, right, different things we can do, and understand the limitations. Lots of limitations. Limitations on the depth of the test, after we find a gap, right, those types of things. Limitations on places from which the data can accidentally leak. And limitation on in-scope devices. All these are different types of things we have to deal with when we're dealing with an assessment. If it's a red team assessment, make sure you understand what you're testing, the IPs within scope. You don't want to test something out of scope. Make sure the objectives, the importance, and the risk level, and understand the risk threshold. And make sure that you've properly budgeted the actual test based on requirements. Testing strategy, right? Depends on the scenario. If it's black box, white box, announced, unannounced, blind, or double blind. We covered those in Module 1. Once we know what it is, then we continue to actually start the test. Do not start the pen test without defining the approach. Areas to test, if we're doing network penetration testing, application penetration testing, social, wireless, mobile, cloud, virtual, whatever we're testing, we have to identify these areas of the infrastructure we're going to test. That's part of your scoping meeting. Targets to test, right? Different targets have the questionnaire. We know we have the questionnaire, so we find out what are we going to test, the IP addresses, maybe the network ranges, domain names, whatever they can give us is going to help us when we go into our costing and doing the actual testing. We got some examples here. Targets, the networks, the applications, your users if social engineering is involved. You can test the whitelisting, blacklisting of different devices like the firewall, the access control list on like your routers. That's things we can test as well. We can test the organization's security policies, and we can test certificate pinning. All these are different types of things we can test when we do an assessment. The internal, external targets to test, right? Different things we can do then within the organization. Yep, we can test the servers. We can look at IIS, application servers, Windows servers, Unix, Linux servers, whatever the servers are. The workstations and desktops. We can test the devices, the routers, the switches, the modems, whatever you have on the network. We want to identify what we're testing. And moreover, we want to identify is any of the things we're testing not provided by our client. Because if they are, we have to get written authorization and permission to test those. Because we only can test what the client has authorization to give us permission to test. Very important. Then we're going to look at any third parties, as we said. If it's a cloud service provider, managed security providers, those types of things, we have to make sure that we have that permission. And if we're doing any testing of a third party, make sure that we vetted it through a legal department or legal guidance to make sure everybody knows we're coming and everybody knows the limitations or restrictions that we have to operate within. Failure to do that can get you into trouble. What about when you go across jurisdiction boundaries, different countries? If servers are located in different countries, those are the type of challenges you have to do as well. So you kind of have to be familiar with the laws of the countries where the targets are located. Understand the client assessment requests, and we've got items to be tested here in the example in the image. Servers, workstation, routers, firewalls, right? Time frame, testing hours. Who's going to be involved in report and who's going to document the delivery. All these are different types of things. All right. Listing test, right? That's not going to be performed. Maybe you won't do social engineering. Maybe you normally hardly ever do denial of service. Make sure that you explain that everybody understands this is what we're going to test and this is what we're not going to test. You want to make clear delineation between the two. Get the proposal of test to conduct and not conduct that we just talked about, and make sure they understand what our scope is, what we're going to test, how we're going to test it, and where we're going to stop. All that's important when you're doing your proposal to make sure everybody understands. I'll give you an example. Most cases, we're not going to do reverse engineering. There's just not enough time to do reverse engineering. So the client needs to understand we're going to test it from an actual scan or a fuzz or something like that, but we're not going to take their applications and do reverse engineering for it. That's going to be what we call beyond scope. If they want that, then we have to come up with a cost for them to have to do that. All right. Desired depth of penetration test. Once you get access, what level do you go to? Are you allowed to crack passwords? You're allowed to do different types of things. All these are part of things we need to understand when we get our scope. Because once you exploit the box or get access to it, remember, you don't have to always exploit the box to get access to it. What you're allowed to do at that point is very important to determine. Determining the project deliverables. Let's talk about the project deliverables. This is what the client expects from you. They're going to have deliverables from your test. It's almost always a report, right? And the report is in electronic form, hard copy form, PDF, HTML, define and discuss with the client what format they prefer. Network test report, client-side test reports, these are the reports to deliver after a pen test. Web application test reports. Lots of different references out there, and you have to do it as part of your LPT or your CPENT. All right. So when you look at it, you got to determine the project schedule. So now you've got your deliverables, you defined your deliverables. How are you going to meet the requirements, and in what schedule are you going to do that? So that's all about test duration, when it's going to start, when it's going to end, and what determines when it ends. This helps us avoid that scope creep, where they get you to try to test things that weren't part of the actual initial testing requirements. All extremely important stuff. Understanding staffing requirements. Now your challenge comes in because when you get the contract and you win it, you have to staff it. So you have to do a little bit of research and understand how this stuff works. So we're going to talk about it. Make sure you have a team in place. Make sure they have different types of expertise, and you blend the team together. Once you have that, you have your network testers, your policy, application, database, and so on, right? All this is important when it comes to staffing these types of tests. And now, once you've done this, what do we do next? We've got to determine the pricing. How are we going to cost this thing? So we have to start figuring out per day, per hour, per project, how much to charge, right? Those different types of things. Everything's kind of part of an example here. It's the scope, the resources, and the time, right? If it's a lot, because like we said, we don't normally do reverse engineering. If you add reverse engineering, that's going to increase the cost, right? So these are the types of things you have to start figuring out, and then figure out where you're going to draw the line. As it says there, negotiation, you got usually a chief penetration tester or a team lead, and they're going to control all those types of things. And it's going to vary based on the scope and the number of man days required to cover the scope. And that's reality. That's one of those things. And sometimes, having done this many times, you underestimate. And if you underestimate, you got to understand you've underestimated. That was your mistake, not the client's mistake. So now that you've done all that and you've got all this ready, you're good to go, what do you do next? Well, now it's time to submit. Now you got to get your executive summary, the high-level synopsis that briefs the client on what's taking place, right? Discussion with different experts in the team. Draft a proposal with the expected response, and submit the proposal before the due date specified by the client. These are all these different types of things. The bidder will receive a notification from the client upon selection of the proposal. And we bid on these things all the time, and sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. It's the nature of any type of competition when you do things. So how do we set the rules of engagement? Well, we have to know what the client wants to achieve. So the rules of engagements are permission. That's our permission to conduct the test, right? Top level guidance for, of course, the top level information. And then the assistance is the legal, federal, and policy related restrictions. All these are different things we have to concern ourselves with. So the scoping and ROE are two aspects that have to be handled independently, right? What should be tested, how it's tested, right? And the manner in which it's going to be tested. All these are different components of ROE, rules of engagement. Brainstorming sessions. So what you do is you have team meetings and you start asking these questions, right? When we're going to do it, the timeline, how we're going to handle the potential evidence, the frequency, time of day to conduct testing. All of these are different considerations we have to have. So the first thing we want to talk about is establishing communication lines. Communication is one of the critical components of any type of testing. You got to make sure everybody communicates. Lack of communication will sink a penetration test in a relatively short time. All right, so when we start looking at it, we have to identify the name of the personnel, the role, the contact numbers, the email addresses, and then somebody in the organization who's going to lead the project, right? That's the whole type of thing. All right. And then we look at the contact details. We've got to have the risk manager, the service providers, the database administrator, network administrator, local security officer, and the systems administrator. We'll make sure we have all these defined for normal situations and all these defined for emergency situations. There's a template for you. Here's an example here. We've got the organization, point of contact name, the number, email address, and you get the idea. Third-party functional area, authority name, information you can do. Again, just another example and a reference for you. Initial teleconference with the target point of contact, right? TPOC as we call it here, and we got the engagement letter, and you get the information needed to set up the engagement, determine who's going to provide the non-disclosure agreement and the data user agreement, and sensitive information. Remember, you're controlling a lot of sensitive information for the client. So how are you going to transmit that to and from? You're going to have to protect it. It's going to be half encrypted in some form. So make sure you get all that actually clarified before you actually finish and start the engagement. And now the timeline. Timeline is based on your scope and what you've been able to do in your research for the rules of engagement to figure out how many hours you're going to be able to dedicate this, how much staff you're going to have, and stuff like that. So the timeline is something you have to actually really work at to get it right. And it takes usually a couple of engagements to happen. So what you want to do is estimate how long it's going to take from start to end. And then what do we have to cover in the engagement? It might be weeks, months, depending on the size. What's the size of the actual engagement? And it's our plan and estimate of how we're going to spend time in the engagement. So say we're going to do network testing, external testing. We have X amount of days for that. We have internal testing. We have X amount of days for that. Then you start going from there. And that's the reality of how this works. Metrics, the amount of experience in the area of testing. If it's a team that's relatively new in it, it's going to take more time. Somebody with more years of experience would take less time. But you have other problems. You have sometimes a network won't be available or something's happening in the organization. All of these can cause problems with your time estimation. So we draft a timeline. The start and time of the project. You can use Gantt charts, work breakdown structures, those types of things. Start and time. The project milestones, project completion. These are the three main components of the timeline for pen testing. The work breakdown structure or task list, that's our measurable task. That means where the task start and end, the time estimates, the task dependencies, and the resources assigned to each task. That's a WBS, otherwise known as a work breakdown structure. Penetration testing schedule, timing and duration. When are we going to be able to do it, right? Thorough design of the tasks, different types of things like that. Documentation of what we're doing. We can use Project Professional, Zoho projects, and Gantt projects, some example tools for this. Time and location. So, normal time scale for the project, local requested time scale, and distribution list of the project. Remember, if we do an external testing, then we got to know when we test, but when we go on site, we got to make sure they know when we're coming on site so they're ready for us, because we almost always need assistance for internal testing in particular from the IT staff of the site. The location, where will the team work, right? Most flexible space, functional requirements, right? Time-consuming process. This is a time-consuming process. So we like to have a room set up that's comfortable, spacious, and well-ventilated. And then, of course, accessible to other areas of the organization that we need. Frequency of meetings. So when you're on site or when you're doing testing, how often are you going to meet? This is another thing that you have to consider. Are you going to keep weekly meetings, daily meetings, right? It really comes up to the client how they want to set the meetings. But the more you keep informed, the client continuously informed about the project, the better it is. Because if you go too long in something you find or something that they have a disagreement with, now you're causing delay in the project completion. Time of day, very important. Are you going to be able to test during the daytime? Or are you going to have to actually live like a vampire and test in the middle of the night? Most time we live like a vampire and test in the middle of the night. So business hours, after business hours, what about weekends? Are we allowed to do testing on weekends? These are all things that have to be considered. Identify personnel for assistance. Who's the people who's going to assist you, right? Local human resources, right, for the pen test, those types of things. The local human resource, the application administrator, database administrator, network administrator, the OS administrator. All these are local resources we have to work with. Because when we're on site doing pen testing, internal pen testing, we like to have both an unauthorized or unauthenticated user, an authenticated user to a regular privilege level, and an authenticated user to a privileged privilege level. All these are actually different things we can do when we're doing our testing. So we need help of the local human resources to carry that out. Find out who the IT security admin is for the client, right? Understand these individuals, who they are, the data and application security. Identify the administrators of the organization, because they can help you with tools and internal testing. Our preference is to work with them and tell them what commands to type in. Then we don't have to know any passwords. We just tell them if they've got to type in and enter a password to go ahead and enter the password. It keeps their passwords protected, otherwise they have to change them all after the test, or they give you a testing account. And clients have different ways of handling it. And to be fair, it's their decision to make. But as testers, we have to be aware of it. Other employees, the administrators, database administrators, networks, OS, a lot of times you can use them to help you with your testing engagement, because maybe you're looking at something you're not totally understanding how the network diagram or what other things works. You can grab one of the administrators and hopefully they can explain it further. Remember, nobody knows the network usually as well as the client. So if we're struggling with figuring something out or we're getting data that's not making any sense, especially when you're doing VLANs, because VLAN, don't get me started on all the VLAN processing going on, you want to get together with the client's team, the IT team, the specialists, and say, hey, I'm seeing this. Can you help me out here? Why am I seeing this? Rules of engagement, we already talked about. It's that formalized document that tells us the rules. The tester and client have to document it, and both parties sign it, right? That's the rules of engagement. Here's an example from X-Security, rules of engagement document. So it gives you information and talks about how we've done reasonable precautions to ensure that everything we're doing in testing is not going to cause any problems, but there's always a chance in testing that something can cause problems. So we want to make sure they understand, and you look there at the bottom of the image on the left-hand side. Does X-Security provide any kind of compensation? No, we can't. When you remember, we will test in a given amount of time what we can test. There's always a finite limit. So in that given amount of time, using a certain level skill set, medium level skill set and below usually, we'll find all the actual findings we can find in that amount of time. All right. So here's a template for you. Again, as I said, a lot of these templates are available. This one's actually from CSRC NIST. This is a NIST template, so you can go to these websites and get their latest templates to help you with your paperwork. Engagement letter from the client. This is the formal letter that comes from the client to tell you the engagement's ready to begin. Remember, there's written authorization and permission. This is your written authorization and permission saying you're able to do what you're able to do. Once you agree on the scope and the rules of engagement, the final engagement letter goes through and you make sure it's signed. You send it, in this case, they're showing electronic format, and you can do integrity checking by using hashing to protect it. So what about legal issues in a penetration testing engagement? As we said, there's times when something could come up and arise and could be something from a legal standpoint you have to deal with. Well, get a lawyer that understands technology, sign a legal document related to the pen test, and make sure the document's vetted by the lawyer before you sign it, reality. And make sure they understand information technology and the risks associated with testing. All of your organizations, your clients, or whoever you're testing, has to understand that your testing could crash something, right? And that's important as well. Your contract, the non-disclosure clause, the objective of the pen test, the fees and the project schedule, right? Sensitive information, what we're going to do with sensitive information, confidential information, indemnification clause, and reporting and responsibilities. All these are different types of things. Drafting the contract. So we draft the contract. It's the most important document because it's going to tell what you're going to do and regulate the legal relationships. You're going to have the scope, the standards, security and confidentiality, how you're going to protect the information, audit information, reporting and cost, and then ownership and license, who's going to own what and who's going to own the license of it. And then how you're going to resolve disputes, because that's very important as well. So here's another example for you from X Security, the penetration testing contract. All right? Always tell them that the client site is never secure from attack. No such thing as 100% security testing. We're going to find what we can find, emulating the level of threat that we've agreed to and the amount of time that the contract's going to be carried out. There's no way to guarantee anything that is 100% secure. Can't do it. Provider shall be under no liability. Remember, unless it's gross negligence, you shouldn't be under any liability for what a scan does, because when a scan takes place, there's inherent risk to the system. So you want to make sure that they understand that. And also, as it says there in the bottom, if there's a breach of the contract, you have a clause in there that talks about maximum of the fees paid by the client, or you have different types of things. And these are all standard templated devices of how we do this. Make sure we got confidential information, we protect each other's confidential information, and we do what? We don't disclose it to anybody. No disclosure directly or indirectly to any third party. Here's an example for you. So you see the data custodian, the business owner, and then component descriptions. Publicly available information, network scanning, system profiling, all these are different examples of your penetration testing contract. Rules of behavior. Make sure that it outlines a framework for external and internal pen testing, right? Prior to actually testing, it's signed by representatives. Okay. Mutual understanding and limitations, release and authorization forms, right? Those types of things. All those are good things to actually see. Harmless and not criminally liable for unintentional interruptions or loss of damage or to equipment. Remember, there's no guarantee that you're not going to break something. So since there's a chance you're going to break something, you want to make sure you're not liable when you break something. Your get out of jail free card is what we call it when you have your written authorization and permission, right? That's your, when somebody says something against, say, no, I had written authorization and permission to do what I did, therefore you can't do anything against me and prosecute and those types of things. Listing the permitted items in the agreement, electronic mapping, right? Adopt employees, and you see there in our chart, are we doing social engineering by mail? The answer is no. Are we breaking into employee workstations? Yes. Are we reading corporate email? No. So when you start looking at this chart, this is a good example of how you want to make sure that you explain what you're going to do in your testing. And by explaining what you're going to do in this testing, now it's easy to set up the written permission. As soon as they give you written permission, those easy, simple yeses there tells you what you're allowed to do and not do. And that's a very important component to make sure you have in your contract. Confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements, as we said, we want to make sure that everybody understands anything we disclose could harm each other or the other party or the other person or the party, so you sign an agreement. And one of the things you remember is you just don't talk about anything. You don't give any information about the test. All the information about the test is treated as confidential. It gives us cover for negligence, liability in the event of an untoward incident. All right. Bear the responsibility. Both parties have responsibility for the tools, techniques, information. Make sure we protect our sensitive information. Who has ownership of what, how we're going to use the evaluation reports, and how we're going to actually use the testing methodology and the client documentation. Non-disclosure agreement, remember, we're going to actually, in this non-disclosure agreement, identify how we're going to protect the information of the client. This is our relationship, so the organization or the client knows we're going to protect their data. Make sure you've got forms that have been vetted by lawyers to make sure there's nothing, you made a mistake, and make sure you have clauses that the team will try not to disclose or any information during the penetration test, right? All these are critical when it comes to setting up your penetration testing contract. Liability, standards and penalties imposed by federal, state, or local governments, breach of the contractual agreement, all right? Other non-contractual civil wrongs, torts is what that's called, different types of things, fraud, right? Federal, state statutes, remember, there's different types of criminalities and penalties based on jurisdiction, and then you got the federal and the state jurisdiction as well. So all these are legal liability issues that you have to be aware of. Negligence. Negligence is you purposely tried to not do something, and when you do that, it results in damages to the injured party. So now, if you're doing your scanning, is the example we have here, and you're required to protect the customer's database, but for some reason the database gets breached and you were the cause of that database being breached, somebody might sue you for negligence. And that's why we have the famous E&O, or another name, liability insurance, errors and omissions insurance, where you want to make sure you're covered for this type of stuff. Contract limitations. Remember, it's confidential between parties. It's the terms and fees of the contract, not released by either party. And we have a team of experts to test these types of things. And it has to be written approval. Without written approval, we don't release any information to the client, information to third parties. So no client information goes to a third party without written authorization and approval. Otherwise, you can get in trouble. Engagement letter vetted by lawyers, as we said. Here's an example of a pen test engagement letter for you. All right? Prepare the document, have the lawyer check it, and make sure it has information with the legal aspects of testing and the scope of the project. I already talked a little bit about the liability insurance, errors and omissions insurance. Make sure you have that. Obtain the insurance, protect your interests, and protect against the risks. Take third-party insurance that covers all losses if it's required. Team members, make sure the team members, remember, we have to make sure we vet our team members, and none of our team members are being used as maybe a mole for another organization who is a competitor of the client we're testing. Make sure all the emails are deleted, right? Make sure you clean and clear out all that type of stuff. Use privacy software to make sure your information on your machines is properly wiped. All those are good. Look for waivers, right? Different types of things. A disclaimer, because we know something's going to happen, a person's actions, right? Those types of things. Exculpatory clauses, which means information of no wrongdoing, so you hold harmless, right? Voluntary, known, or established by legal fiction, right? All these are types of things to be considered. And then make sure that you relinquish, the rights are relinquished if they're not asserted at the time. So all these are different types of things we can do. And you can imagine, this is legal territory. So you either got to hire a little attorney or have some attorney experiences yourself. All right. Constraints. Is there a service level agreement for the project that might affect your scope of a test? Do you have a waiver or privilege level for different partners to perform the testing? Remember, if you're going to test anybody outside of who your direct client is, you have to make sure you have a letter and written authorization permission to do that. And now, after you've done all this paperwork, we're finally do what? We're ready to prepare for the test. So when we prepare for the test, we have specific things we have to do. All right. Engagement letter, of course, set up our folders, housekeeping, right? Create a system to maintain the data and start your document engagement process and make sure you have all your documentation structure set up before you do the test. Create the engagement log. Do everything, document everything that's taken place. Every team member, what they do, where they did it, all that information goes inside the engagement documents in a folder, right? Different types of things. And then you have the kickoff meeting. This is the first meeting between the project team and the client. And what do? You tell them, this is what we understand, here's our goals, and here's the team members going to be doing that, and information related to the plan, methodologies, and processes. And we clarify expectations. Make sure that you clarify expectations. They have to understand what you can do, what you can't do, and how you're going to do it, right? The executive sponsor, of course, the key stakeholders, and anybody who's conducting the assessment. So we create a statement of work that gives us our step-by-step process of the services that we are going to do. It's our contractual document that tells exactly what our objectives are, what the actions we're going to perform are, and then, like it's number 4 there, the deliverables. And what's the limitations on the liability? And everybody understands there's significant risk to the customer's network. Delineate that risk within the scope of work. No denial of service is the most common thing we're going to remove and not allow any of that. It provides us ROE, rules of engagement for penetration testing services. Here's an example of how to do it. If we're going to use port scanners, you can use the tool list, the vulnerability scanners, application scanners, you get the idea. Different types of information we can provide for the client. Security tools. Hardware and software, processes, right, those types of things. Again, when we're running testing, we want to have the strongest machine, be it laptop or whatever we're doing the testing from, we can actually support. So always get the most RAM, the most storage, and the highest processing speeds you can get. And get your testing plan. Now we got the project plan, we got everything ready, now we got to define the goals of the project. Well, that's your project plan. Once we got our project plan in place, we start identifying the actual approach, what our assumptions are, and the financial aspects. And a well-developed project plan is said to be half of the actual task. If you get a project plan in place and it's solid, you'll be able to follow a systematic step of processes and procedures that's going to give you a common output. And it doesn't get any better than that. The test plan, documented details of the structure of the procedures for the test, right? Industry standard, establishes ground rules, all those types of things. Probability of achieving favorable results, all that's enhanced with the test plan. The content, the project definition, project goal, test objective, the scope of the testing effort, schedule and location, resource and budget limitations, legal, regulatory issues, success factors, assumptions, analysis, and reviews. These are all components of the content of your test plan. In building a penetration test plan, set up a test goal, define the objects to be tested, hire a skilled penetrator, and bind the penetration analysis resources. All these part of that test plan. Sign an identifier that's unique, project authorization, quality assurance and project plan, configuration management plan, relevant policies, relevant standards. All these are the different types of things that's going to explain what's the items and features that we're going to test. X-Security has a nice little test plan checklist for you. So it's an example. Scope of the project, items listed, information, or we got a change control board. All these information is available in a test plan checklist. So you might want to check that out. Here's more information, the project name, the description, test objectives, right, the methods, all those information, other types of things, how we're going to do our test, and then very important there at the bottom is the deliverables. What are we going to deliver? So hardware, software requirements, as we said, get the strongest machine you can have, right? Have virtual machines, Linux OSs, all those types of things. Again, it's really up to the organization. Devices, potentially keyloggers, jamming devices, you got to make sure you're allowed to do that. Everybody has different telephone spying devices, these types of things, all depends on your scope of work. Of course, you want hacking tools, you want your actual equipment set up, and maybe even some software like the commercial tool, Core Impact, stuff like that. And then your job as the team lead is assign your resources. Break it into smaller tasks. Remember, the way this stuff works is you take a project and you break it into smaller tasks. Select resources for each task, assign them. Equipment, personnel, all that type of stuff. Brief the personnel on the task and provide hardware, software tools if required. Set up your internal control questionnaires to the client. If it's other operating systems, make sure we've identified that, determine these questionnaires, and get the information, right? Is it sent to the client as part of the advanced packet, right? All these are different types of things we want to make sure that the client answers questions. Because there's no pen test we're ever going to do where we don't have questions that we have to ask the client. And that's just the way this testing stuff works. Previous penetration testing vulnerability assessment reports, probably not going to get it, but you can at least try. It does help if they actually have it available and they can give it to you. This actually works pretty well. Create a data use agreement, right? Your data use agreement, the HIPAA, whatever we're doing, those types of things, and make sure you sign this data use agreement to protect any information if you run into information that's protected under one of these standards. Like in this example here, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. All these are different types of things you want to consider. A teleconference, make sure you have a teleconference with the client. Make sure there's any questions about the engagement, right? The questionnaires, the rules of engagement, the non-disclosure agreement. Make sure you get all your questions answered and probe and ask them, does anybody have any questions? Do that on a regular basis because sometimes they won't ask the question, but we want them to ask as many questions as possible if there's any concerns. Determine a date for delivery, when we're going to deliver it, and then how we're going to deliver it, in person, by mail, those types of things. And realize if it's by email, you're going to have to put in protections in place and exchange keys or encryption keys or something to protect that data. Sending the final engagement control document to the client for the signature. Once they get it, they sign it, and we're good to go. Penetration testing permission from the stakeholders. Remember, we got to get written authorization. There's always a chance that something could crash when we're doing a penetration test. Make sure they understand that. Identify the individuals who might be affected by a penetration test. Our stakeholder, who affects or can be affected. Make sure we get permission, right? Obtain permission from stakeholders. Avoid future litigations. That's how we do it, by getting permission. Make sure we know who needs to be informed and when they should be contacted. And report and document the result. That's all part of requirements from the company's stakeholders. If you have to, there might be a time when you have to get permission from the local law enforcement agency. Make sure that you have legal involved with that, and make sure you're following the laws in the jurisdiction of where you're doing the testing. If you're doing a test on the internet or those types of things, make sure that it's an actual network where you have permission to test it. If there's any uncertainties in the law, make sure the attorney or somebody knows that you might have inadvertently broke a law based in the jurisdiction. But hopefully number 4 never happens, because 1 through 3, you do your due diligence. As long as you know the jurisdiction, you're familiar with the laws and principles of that jurisdiction, you should be okay. If you have to go on site for the client, you might have to sign in some ID cards, those type of things. And of course, that's going to allow you to enter the company's premises. Depends on the organization. Make sure that each tester has a unique identity or access card, so one tester can't share a card with 3 people, because then you have no accountability. Gather information on the client organization's history and background. Yeah, make sure they understand that we got the security model. We're looking at the security model of the organization. How are they protecting their confidentiality, their integrity, the availability, all those types of things. Look for information on the client organization in your history and background of websites. You could do that. Search engine, who is tools. We talked about Shodan, all those types of things. Yep. Visiting, becoming familiar with the premises. If you can visit on-prem, visit the premises. Look at the facilities, look at the different areas. Get acquainted with the premises, check the premises, and choose a location. All these are different types of things to help you do your testing. Local equipment required. Make sure that you carry enough power cord. That's always one of the biggest things, to make sure you have power available. But you have power strips. You might need fiber taps, converters, those types of things. You might need internet access. All these are different types of things you want to make sure you identify before you go on site to do the test for the client. Mission briefing, and this is where we actually give information and we prepare the brief, and we make sure everybody understands in the group of what we're going to do. Find out if anybody's got any questions and make sure we answer those questions, and make sure everybody clearly understands their part of the mission. If they don't, explain it to them. And the only way to get that information is to make sure we ask them questions. Once we ask them questions or ask them for feedback, we should be able to identify the things we need. So what about scope creep? Let's talk about handling scope creep during pen testing. Well, unfortunately, it happens. So don't let your penetration test land you in legal hot water. We got to be careful with scope creep. We always do, right? Don't fall victim when a client said, forgotten to include that in a statement of work. It's a serious trap. Remember, you, with a statement of work, are defining what you're going to test. If the client comes back later and says, oh, we forgot that, then you have to do what's called a contract mod. So you're going to do a contract mod to include that. Do not go and do it for free, because you start doing it for free, and they're going to keep asking for more and more. So you always got to be careful of scope creep. The example here shows test beyond the scope. Make the client understand, if we're going to go beyond the scope, we're going to have to do a contract mod. That's because it takes more time. So they got to pay for the additional test. If they don't want to pay for the additional test, then we politely refuse to do it. We want to make sure they understand we have a statement of work, we agreed to a statement of work, and now you're wanting to add to the actual statement of work. You don't get to do that without paying, because these are engagements that you've estimated based on that scope of work. Right? If they change that scope or statement of work, now we need a contract mod to hold that into play, and more likely, more importantly, we get paid for it. Right? We don't want to do something for free, we want to get paid for it. And this brings us to the end of the module. In this module, we looked at some of the components we have to start thinking about when we do a penetration test. One of the most important things was the scope. Scope must be clearly understood. We said this is important. Make sure you have meetings, you have teleconferences, whatever you have, but make sure everybody understands the scope, and that helps you have a clearly defined statement of work, which gives you what are you going to do for the client, right? That's your test plan. As we said, you're going to have legal and lawyers involved. You have to know your rules of engagement, what you're allowed to test, when you're allowed to test, those types of things. Is denial of service, social engineering, all those types of things allowed? And you have to make sure that you understand as the tester, this is the statement of work. If they ask for more than that, scope creep, we want to make sure we tell them that that requires a contract mod, that requires X amount of more financial input into the actual testing. By doing that, you can have a good, effective, solid penetration testing plan. And with that, we'll conclude this module.